Why let people disappoint you? Jung insight. There's something most people do the first time someone they love reveals themselves to be smaller than the image they'd built. They don't see it. Not because they're stupid, because the mind does something almost involuntary in that moment. It edits. The behavior gets softened, contextualized, explained away. They were stressed. It was a bad week. That's not really who they are. And the editing job is so automatic, so fast, that most people don't even notice it happening. What they notice instead is a vague sense of unease they can't quite name, a slight shift in the light they can't trace back to its source. The truth was right there. The mind just didn't want it yet. Disappointing people reveal more about human nature than loyal people ever will, because loyalty is genuinely easy to misread. Sometimes people stay because they love you. Sometimes they stay because you listen, because you tolerate, because you keep forgiving things other people wouldn't. Sometimes they stay because you're useful, and useful is a very comfortable thing to be standing next to. Most people never learn the difference between those kinds of staying until disappointment forces the question. Carl Jung believed one of the most dangerous illusions we carry is the illusion of the idealized person, not because other people are evil, but because the mind desperately wants alignment between what it hopes and what it actually sees. So when someone reveals their selfishness, their envy, their emotional cowardice, or their willingness to manipulate, the average person does something strange. They deny the evidence, not consciously, psychologically, because accepting what's actually in front of them would force a second, harder confrontation with the realization that the attachment wasn't really to the person, it was to who they wanted that person to be. And that realization tends to hurt the ego far more than the disappointment itself. Most of the real suffering doesn't come from toxic people. It comes from the fantasy that they were supposed to be different, the negotiation with reality. Once you start looking for it, you see this pattern everywhere. The friend who only surfaces when they need something. The partner who slowly withdraws once they stop benefiting from your presence. The family member who's supportive right up until your growth edges past their comfort zone. But people rarely accept these patterns when they first appear. Instead, they do what might be called negotiating with reality. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe if I become more understanding, more patient, more available, they'll eventually become who I imagined. The problem with that negotiation is that reality has a brutal and consistent habit. Patterns repeat harder than promises. And eventually, life backs you into a corner where you can no longer do the emotional editing. You see the person without the filter, and what's there is simply what was always there. Jung would call that moment the death of illusion, not the death of love, but the death of projection. Because most of us were never entirely seeing the other person to begin with. We were seeing our own unfinished emotional needs reflected back. The need to be chosen, the need to feel important, the need to believe that loyalty still exists in its pure, uncomplicated form. So we built a psychological fiction around ordinary human behavior and called it a relationship. And the darker part of that truth is this. A lot of people actively benefit from your refusal to see them clearly. Your optimism protects them. Your empathy excuses them. Your patience delays any consequence for their behavior. Kindness without limits quietly teaches people how to use you, and that sentence makes people uncomfortable because it dismantles a comforting belief that being good automatically calls goodness out of others. It doesn't. Sometimes it invites dependency. Sometimes it invites manipulation. Sometimes it invites a quiet contempt that the other person may not even fully recognize in themselves. Human beings sense far more than they let on. They notice who avoids conflict, who fears being left, who over-explains, who keeps forgiving long after trust is actually broken. And slowly, unconsciously, the dynamic shifts. Not through evil intent, just through human nature running its course. This is where disappointment becomes something other than a wound, because the moment you let people actually disappoint you, the moment you stop protecting them from what they've revealed, you stop needing them to maintain your emotional story. You begin seeing behavior without the edit, and once that happens, almost every relationship in your life eventually changes shape. Not because you pushed anyone away, but because you finally stopped pulling the narrative together yourself. What disappointment actually reveals. Most people think disappointment ruins relationships. What it usually does is reveal the relationship that was already there. The illusion simply dies first. And what replaces it is often unsettling, because once you stop idealizing someone, the patterns that were always visible suddenly can't be unnoticed. You see how certain people only warm up when they sense you might be slipping away. How specific friends fold a low-grade mockery of your ambition into their humor. How some connections survive entirely on your emotional output while the other person contributes almost nothing except occasional, inconsistent attention. At first, these realizations feel like a kind of cruelty, not because they're false, but because they destroy something. There's a version of psychological maturity nobody warns you about. It's not becoming wiser exactly. It's becoming harder to deceive emotionally. Jung believed the human personality contains hidden dimensions. The conscious mind refuses to look at what he called the shadow. Not just rage or violence, but envy, neediness, manipulation, cowardice, the quiet desire to control how other people perceive us. Most people spend their entire lives insisting these traits belong to other people, to bad people, to people unlike themselves. But disappointment complicates that story, because eventually you realize something uncomfortable. The people who hurt you were often protecting their own ego the entire time. The friend who betrayed your trust may have been quietly envying your growth long before they walked away. The partner who withdrew affection may have feared real intimacy more than they feared loneliness. The person who kept lying to you may not have hated you at all. They simply couldn't tolerate being seen clearly. Human beings protect identity before they protect truth, almost every time. And once you genuinely understand that, social behavior starts to look very different. Compliments become easier to read. Apologies begin to sound rehearsed. Attention starts carrying a transactional weight you hadn't previously noticed. You start seeing how often people perform emotions rather than actually feeling them, not because humanity is entirely fake, but because survival taught people to construct masks long before they developed any real self-awareness. That's part of why disappointment lands as hard as it does. It doesn't just expose other people, it exposes how desperately you wanted the illusion. People don't resent your weakness, as the old observation goes. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. That sentence explains more relationship dynamics than most people are willing to sit with, because growth shifts the social balance. The moment you become less controllable, less dependent, less hungry for validation, certain people start reacting differently to your presence. Not openly, subtly. They become colder, more sarcastic, less enthusiastic about your wins, more passive in their resistance. And if you're still carrying the old belief that the people who really care about you always want the best for you, this behavior becomes genuinely confusing. What did I do wrong? Why does feeling better seem to be making certain relationships worse? Jung had a clear answer for this, and it wasn't a comfortable one. People often love the version of you that keeps them psychologically comfortable, the predictable version, the smaller version, the version that never forces them to examine their own stagnation by comparison. Disappointment becomes the door into seeing this clearly, not emotionally, structurally. You begin to recognize that many relationships are, at their core, unconscious agreements. I'll stay this version of myself if you stay yours. That's why your evolution feels threatening. Your new limits feel offensive. Your silence reads as arrogance. Your independence feels personal, like something done to them. And the disturbing detail is that most people won't consciously know why their attitude toward you shifted. Human beings rationalize emotions after they've already felt them. Discomfort arrives first, and then the mind invents an explanation for it. That's why some people slowly withdraw after you genuinely start healing, not because healing made you worse, but because awareness made you harder to manage without either of you quite realizing what had changed. The silence after letting go. There's a phase that comes after real disappointment that almost feels inhuman. Internal silence. Not quiet in the world, quiet in the mind, the kind that arrives when you finally stop chasing explanations for why someone became who they turned out to be. You stop replaying conversations, looking for the moment you could have changed something. You stop trying to decode the mixed signals. You stop attempting to rescue the image you once had of the person. And strangely, that silence tends to hurt more than the betrayal itself, because the mind runs on narrative. As long as you're still searching for reasons, some part of you still believes the original story can be salvaged. But the moment real acceptance moves in, something colder enters the room: clarity. And clarity doesn't offer much emotional warmth. You begin remembering things differently, the joke that landed with a slight edge, the concern that had something proprietary underneath it, the subtle competition running just below the surface of what looked like friendship, the way certain people went quiet, the moment you stopped being useful to them emotionally. At first, you wonder if you're just becoming cynical. But cynicism and pattern recognition aren't the same thing. Cynicism assumes everyone is bad. Awareness simply notices that most people are divided inside themselves, holding contradictions they never fully reconcile. Jung understood this specifically. He didn't believe people are a single, unified personality. They're contradictions that have learned to present as coherent. Someone can love you and resent you at the same time. They can support you publicly while quietly competing with you. They can need your presence while feeling genuinely threatened by your growth. Most social tension comes from this hidden duality, because people say one thing consciously, while their behavior leaks a different truth underneath. Words are edited. Behavior reveals the draft. Once you start seeing this, you can't fully unsee it. You begin noticing how often people communicate through implication rather than honesty, the deliberate delay in a response meant to establish some invisible hierarchy, the withdrawal of attention calculated to create uncertainty, the strategic inconsistency that keeps other people emotionally off balance. Most people don't recognize these dynamics consciously in themselves, but they operate them instinctively. That's why certain relationships leave you exhausted without a clear reason you can point to. Your nervous system detected the manipulation long before your mind was willing to name it. And here is where the realization goes darker. Some people are not actually attached to you. They're attached to access. Access to your energy, your reassurance, your attention, your forgiveness, your emotional availability. The moment that access changes, their behavior changes with it. That realization breaks something in idealistic people, because they spent years believing that effort creates loyalty. It doesn't always. Sometimes effort only increases consumption. The more you give, the more people normalize receiving, until your presence becomes expected rather than valued. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. That's why disappointment tends to feel lonely, not because nobody is there, but because your perception has changed faster than your emotional attachments can keep up. Part of you still has feelings for the person. Another part has finally seen them, and those two realities begin pulling against each other. What you were really refusing to see. This is the shadow confrontation. Jung was actually pointing at not confronting darkness in other people, but confronting your own refusal to see reality, because reality was threatening something you needed. Because if you admit that someone never valued you the way you imagined, you also have to confront why you accepted so little for so long. That question changes people quietly and permanently, because you eventually realize that the deepest betrayals are rarely sudden. They're prolonged patterns you recognized early and negotiated with instead of facing. And once that sinks in, the past starts rearranging itself, not dramatically, more like a slow correction in how you're reading something you've been holding upside down. You start remembering the hesitation in someone's voice, the envy hiding just behind their encouragement, the strange emotional distance that appeared consistently whenever you succeeded at something. Your body noticed those things at the time. Your mind simply refused to cooperate. Because human beings are genuinely attached to emotional continuity, attached enough that we'd rather preserve a familiar pain than face an unfamiliar truth. At least disappointment still allows some version of the fantasy to survive. Truth removes the fantasy completely. Jung believed this is where individuation actually begins, not in becoming confident, not in self-improvement content, not in being admired for your growth, but in separating perception from projection, in learning to see people without running your unmet emotional needs through them first. Most people never fully do this. They keep recreating the same emotional pattern with a new cast. Different friend, different partner, different betrayal, same psychological structure underneath. Because the unconscious always returns to what it hasn't resolved. That's why certain people keep attracting manipulators, or emotionally unavailable partners, or relationships that follow the exact same arc as the last one, not because they deserve that pain, but because familiarity creates unconscious pull. Chaos can feel like chemistry when dysfunction has been emotionally normalized for long enough. And this is exactly where disappointment starts to become strangely liberating, because the more clearly you see human nature, the less personally you take its contradictions. You stop expecting permanence from people who were always temporary. You stop reading inconsistency as mystery. You stop trying to heal people who are committed to misunderstanding themselves, and that realization alone can save an enormous amount of exhaustion. Because many people genuinely don't want truth. They want comfort that leaves their identity intact. Truth is dangerous to the ego, especially when someone has spent years building a personality around victimhood, superiority, innocence, or control. If reality threatens that self-image, most people will distort reality rather than let go of the identity. It sounds harsh until you recognize that you've probably done some version of it too. That's why real accountability is rare, not because humans are incapable of reflection, but because reflection often requires something that feels like a small death of the self. The ego resists that violently. People will lose entire relationships before they'll lose the version of themselves they've emotionally invested in. Read that once, and it sounds dramatic. Read it again while thinking of specific people from your own life, and it starts explaining a lot. The friend who managed to make every conflict somehow your fault. The partner who rewrote history during arguments with such confidence you eventually doubted your own memory. The family member who demanded loyalty while denying the damage that was obvious to everyone in the room except them. These weren't always deliberate cruelties. Sometimes they were self-protection, operating at a depth neither person could fully see at the time. What seeing clearly actually costs. The more self-aware you become, the harder it gets to participate in certain social performances. Small talk starts feeling like theater. Friendships built entirely on mutual distraction start feeling hollow. You begin noticing how much of ordinary social life runs on collective pretending to care, pretending to listen, pretending to be happy for people you're actually competing with, pretending to be honest while editing everything that matters. Not always out of malice. Sometimes people have simply become strangers to themselves, and performing connection is easier than attempting the real thing. When you finally understand that, forgiveness starts changing shape. Not the soft, demonstrative kind people perform to appear spiritually evolved, something quieter and colder. You stop forgiving people because you expect reconciliation. You forgive because you no longer want to stay emotionally tethered to an illusion. That distinction changes everything, because a lot of people aren't actually suffering from a betrayal anymore. They're suffering from their own resistance to accepting that someone revealed exactly who they were. The mind keeps reopening the wound, hoping the memory will eventually transform into something different. It doesn't. People rarely become painful overnight. The signs were usually present earlier, in fragments, small moments, minor inconsistencies, emotional absences that were easy to explain away individually, but formed a clear pattern in aggregate. But hope stitched the fragments into a different picture. Hope has its beauty. Psychologically, though, hope is also capable of dismantling perception, especially in lonely people, especially in empathetic people, especially in people who quietly believe love is something you earn through endurance. Those people tolerate things others would leave immediately. Disrespect gets filed as stress. Neglect becomes confusion. Manipulation becomes something called complicated. And slowly they abandon their own perception in order to preserve the connection. This is why disappointment eventually becomes not just inevitable but necessary. Not tragic, necessary, because some illusions only die through repetition. The same betrayal, the same cycle, the same realization surfacing through different people, until the mind can no longer avoid the pattern underneath all of them. Once the pattern becomes undeniable, a strange detachment starts forming. You stop trying to make people value you correctly. That particular urge disappears. And it disappears not through bitterness, but through a specific kind of maturity. The recognition that being misunderstood isn't always an accident. Some people actually benefit from misreading your worth. It protects their ego. It maintains their sense of control. It preserves whatever emotional leverage they've built the relationship on. If they acknowledged your value clearly, they'd also have to confront how poorly they'd been treating you, and a lot of people will avoid that confrontation for years, sometimes indefinitely. So instead, they rewrite you. You become too sensitive, too distant, too serious, too much anything except accurately seen, because accurate perception creates guilt, and guilt threatens the identity they've built. This is why growing awareness can feel isolating, not because you became superior to anyone, but because you stopped signing the invisible contracts that most social life is built on. You no longer chase approval from people who keep it just out of reach. You no longer mistake inconsistency for depth. You no longer interpret the minimum of someone's attention as proof of something meaningful, and suddenly certain dynamics simply lose their power over you. Attention stops feeling intoxicating. Charm stops being enough. Words stop carrying more weight than behavior, because once you understand that behavior is where the unconscious actually speaks, words start sounding like what they often are, the edited version. And maybe this is what Jung was pointing at when he talked about consciousness not becoming perfect or even particularly wise, but becoming honest enough to see reality without constantly reshaping it to protect your emotional comfort. Because the temptation to romanticize what wounds you is nearly constant, to assign depth to neglect, to find mystery in inconsistency, to insist that confusion means complexity. Clarity doesn't have patience for any of that. The moment you stop asking how to make someone finally see your value, a different question shows up. Why were you working so hard to be valued by someone who couldn't perceive you clearly in the first place? That question changes your standards permanently, because once awareness enters a relationship, illusion can't fully recover. After enough disappointment, you stop fearing the loss of people. You start fearing something else, the loss of self-respect required to keep them. That's the inversion nobody prepares you for. The more clearly you see human nature, the less hatred you tend to carry, because hatred still contains attachment, still contains expectation, still contains the emotional investment of someone who believed things should have been different. Awareness becomes quieter than hatred. You stop arguing with what people revealed. You stop expecting unconscious people to suddenly become self-aware because you love them with enough patience. You stop expecting loyalty from people whose sense of self is organized around convenience. You stop expecting depth from people who are genuinely frightened of their own interior life. And slowly your entire relationship with disappointment transforms. It stops feeling like punishment It starts feeling like information because every disappointment removes something. Another illusion, another projection, another emotional story you were maintaining between yourself and what was actually there. Jung once wrote that enlightenment doesn't come from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. People tend to read darkness as evil. What it usually means is simply truth the ego hasn't agreed to accept yet. The truth that some people only loved your usefulness, that some only loved their access to your attention, that some only loved the version of you that stayed manageable, and perhaps the one that lands hardest. Some people never actually knew you at all. They knew the role you played in their emotional world, the helper, the listener, the one who forgave things and kept showing up. The moment you stopped playing that role, the relationship changed. Not because you betrayed them, because you interrupted the illusion. And that, more than anything, explains why disappointment changes people as deeply as it does. It doesn't just destroy innocence. It destroys the psychological dependence on fantasy that innocence was built on. After that, you move through the world differently, more observant, more careful with trust, more willing to let things be what they actually are, instead of what you need them to be. Not colder, exactly, just harder to deceive. And in a strange and genuine way, that may be the beginning of something that actually deserves to be called peace. What takes the longest to learn, and what nobody can really teach you ahead of time, is that letting people disappoint you isn't a passive act. It's not about lowering your expectations or resigning yourself to a grim picture of humanity. It's actually closer to a discipline, and a difficult one. The practice of refusing to protect people from what they've shown you about themselves. Every time you do the edit, every time you construct the explanation and stitch the fragments back into a better story, you're doing work that was never yours to do. You're building a version of someone that exists only in your own head, and then spending real emotional energy trying to stay connected to that version while the actual person does whatever they do. Letting people disappoint you means letting the information land. It means allowing the pattern to be a pattern instead of a series of isolated incidents. It means trusting what your nervous system already registered before your mind argued it back into something softer. None of that is easy when you love someone. None of it is clean. The love doesn't always dissolve when the illusion does. Sometimes it sits there intact for a long time while you slowly adjust to the distance between who someone is and who you needed them to be. But there is something on the other side of that adjustment that is worth crossing through the discomfort for. Not cynicism, not hardness. Just an honesty about people, including yourself, that makes the connections you do eventually form feel like they're built on something real, something that doesn't require you to do the editing job in order to survive. That's not a small thing. For a lot of people, it's the whole thing. Now, I'd like to share a meaningful story with everyone. The wedge in between. He came yesterday, stayed through tomorrow. This was the moment wedged between. He said, "Hey darling," and held me, like I was naked again. But I was not naked. I was layered like a wedding cake. Cotton on cotton on cotton, topped by wool, the last cloth several inches removed from my nipple. But there it was, my nipple stiff and hard, feeling his chest hairs. My nipples can feel a man's chest hairs 1 mile away. I said, "Well, watcha, say, sweets?" He said, "Are you still mad, darling?" I said, "Depends. Are you sorry?" He said, "No. I did nothing wrong." I said, "Then I am still mad." He said, "Darling, you are complex." And my nipples? They were still hard, could still feel his chest hairs. I was not really mad. I like to play mad, although I did deserve to be mad. He was what my mama used to call enervating. She had all these big words reserved for certain people. I said, "Sweets, you are enervating." He kept holding me, like this moment wedged in between his sinning and tomorrow was all we had. I figured he was thinking about sorry, how to say it in such a way as to avoid confession. I had always been the sorry person. Even when he forgot the split wood and we were without electricity, I managed to find fault in myself. I had kept him in bed with me too long, tiring him out. We ended up burning some of our old furniture. We had sex a few more times, and I said I'm sorry over and over. It feels great during an orgasm. Oh God, gets old. But, "I'm sorry, try it." He said, "You need to tell the truth, you always lying." I said, "Sweets, I am as innocent as that mole on the inside of your thigh." He said, "You have a mouth on you and a chip on your shoulder. Bad combination." I said, "But I say I'm sorry." He said, "Well, yes you do." I said, "And you don't?" He said, "No I don't." And there it was. Yesterday was vinegar and spit rolled up into bodies. Him, the non-sorry. Me, the sorry. Him, the confident one. Me, the mouth with scars. Tomorrow is a million days sepia. Him, hunger reaching for hamburgers with chips on the side. Me, desire reaching for a diaper. The how to grow. The new human book. My hard nipples, a distant memory. When his hands made it to my skin, he laughed and said, "I know you will confess your sins, darling." I said I did nothing wrong, but I did just what he said. I said, I'm sorry, all night long, until the sun rose over tomorrow, and the days came at me dull, and my feet hit the hardwood floor like small sacks of sugar waiting to be tossed. Dear viewers, that was our channel's discussion on the topic. Why let people disappoint you? Jung Insight. If you found this video helpful or meaningful, please consider subscribing to support the channel. If you'd like me to create more content about emotions, relationships, or other psychological topics, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I'll do my best to help you understand why you're feeling the way you do and what's really happening beneath the surface. For now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you.